So today on the episode, we're going to talk about rent control. So I got a comment on the last YouTube video from Jim Imler 9110, and he had said a definite cause of supply is that the government imposed rent controls have made it extremely complicated to rent out a property or portion of a property. In Vancouver, our rental supply has significantly dried up for that reason. Well, you'll always hear the argument for rent control, and it's politically, it sounds great. I think a lot of people think, if the government has the ability to slow rent growth, they should do it. And they never look at all the negatives that come with it. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about, a lot of the downsides to rent control, because on the surface, if you're a renter, seems like a great idea. I think rent control is generally misunderstood, right? It's there on its face. It looks like it's there to protect the tenants. But really what it does in practice is it discourages development, it reduces the housing supply overall, and it kind of not incentivizes, but it does make it so landlords won't take care of their property. Because as a landlord, if I can only raise rents 2%, but my city taxes are going up 8 or 9%, I can't spend any money keeping that property up. And also kind of most people's model is like, hey, we're gonna take an older building and we're going to make it really nice. We're going to get rents up a little bit, give a better experience to the tenants. That all goes away because it doesn't matter if I renovate the unit, I can't get my rents up. So I can't spend the money, right? And there's all these horror stories of the big cities that have done it for sure years ago where, they would just stop providing hot water, or they do all these things because they could no longer afford to do it as a building owner. And when you hear things like the people who are pushing it, you'll always hear, even in the single family house, market, where they'll talk about corporate landlords or big companies coming and buying stuff up. And I think what people do tend to miss a lot is that a corporate landlord or a large fund that buys real estate, generally that's just made up of a bunch of people investing in that fund. So probably almost everybody out there, some portion of your pension or your retirement plan, is put into real estate, and that comes through a REIT or one of these corporate landlords. So it's not just benefiting, one person. There's generally always, with public companies, a lot of people that, benefiting from that. And when people talk about profiteering in a negative light, it's like the only reason someone's going to buy a property is there has to be some profit there. And I think the big misconception is landlords don't dictate rent in an open market. The market does. So if I could dictate what the rents were, I would double all of the rents in my property and make double the money. I can't do that because nobody's going to rent them. Supply and demand dictates what the rent will be. So it's just market driven, and that's how a market should work. If rents start going up, more people are going to develop if they're allowed to charge higher rents. And then you get more supply and rents will slow down. When you have markets that are really tight, that have rent control, development slows down. You'll see if rent control all of a sudden comes into a market and it's very hard for landlords to make profit anymore, they'll try to deconvert those buildings, turn them into condos. Or you'll see, I think in Vancouver and Toronto, you see this already, where there's a lot of condo development because you can still make money there, right? And I think a good example of how I do believe everybody or even the people who push rent control understand that long-term it's probably not a good idea, is almost every place where there's rent control, they take it off for new development. So it'll be on existing product, and a lot of places have it. If you build a new building, you can, it's kind of exempt from rent control. So if they do it on new buildings, they really don't believe that the program works, in my opinion. They know that it slows development or stops development. But when you look at a market and how much supply comes on every year, maybe it's a couple percent of new units versus the whole market. So you're kind of saying that, a huge portion of the market can only raise rents a little bit. Well, you're always going to get the people that just run those buildings down. They just try to squeeze every dollar out of it, and they don't really care what happens. And then those markets are going to come offline. And if you can take an old building, renovate it, get the rents up, and have a place where people want to live, like in any of our properties, I always say the standard should be that me or my family could go and live in that building. If I'm not allowed to get rents up and actually renovate the units and renovate the common areas and spend the money on the property, that's not the case. We're not going to be able to do that, right? And there's never going to be a guarantee from the city that the taxes aren't going to go up. So I think they went up almost 8% in Edmonton this year and 6 or 8% last year. And if we had a 2% cap on rents, the model, it doesn't work. Insurance fluctuates, right? It in the last 10 years, it went up drastically. If you're at a property, you can't raise the revenue, and now all your expenses are climbing, right? Energy, there's no set, we have to pay whatever the price of natural gas is. So when you can't dictate any of the expense side, but you can dictate the income side, it just makes it very hard for anybody to want to develop. And I did pull a couple places, where they have done this. And I had heard a politician when in Minnesota, I believe, or Minneapolis and the Twin Cities there, they both were putting it in, and they were talking to this one politician and asking her, she said, rent controls worked in other markets. And they said, well, name another market, name one market that it's worked. And, she named San Francisco, which I think has been one of the highest rent areas in America. So it really, I don't think you could point to somewhere that works. I think Canada's a good example. You look at Toronto, Vancouver have it to some degree, and they're the highest rent in Canada and very high in North America. You look at Edmonton and Calgary, the reason we're seeing so much immigration here is we don't have rent control, and it's supply and demand. So we have lower prices, higher supply. Developers still want to build, and it so that supply can align with demand. So yeah, like San Francisco, New York, I think are both good examples of that in the States, where they have rent control and they have crazy high rents. Houston and Dallas, there's zero rent control. They build, then they probably build way too much. I think you'll see rents come down in those cities because developers wanted to build when the boom was there, and there's lots of supply coming online now. Another negative, if you're a owner of multifamily in a rent controlled area, is you're almost held hostage by the tenants to some degree, because you might have a tenant that's been in there for 30 years, and is paying $1,200 and rent should be $2,000. Well, you don't want to sell that building at if you take $1,200 and add the cap rate, what that building's worth versus if it's $2,000. So it also limits that side of it, where like you can't sell until someone moves out. I know a guy right where the fires were in California owned a house, and he talked about that. He said the reason houses are so expensive is because of that. If you have a tenant in there, you have to wait till they leave to be able to get the rent up, and nobody ever wants to leave because it's going to be so much more expensive somewhere else. And that becomes a problem too, where generally if rent control comes in, landlords are going to get creative on how to get tenants out, and then they're going to add more and more legislation. Like you'll see cities put in, you can't do what do they call them, like rent eviction. So if you want to go in and renovate the unit, you can't get rid of somebody, and you have to. They just keep adding layers on because landlords need to get people out, and you see it. I don't think there's ever a good case for rent control, or somewhere where you could point to and say it worked really, really good here. And I always tell people, with anything in government, you look at anything you want that the government touches or runs, it doesn't run efficient. It's not efficient, right? So I don't think the government, I think the free market does its thing. And I think you've seen that in Edmonton and Calgary. And now, Calgary rents are going up. People are moving there, and I'm sure you'll see more development there, right? So I don't think rent control is the answer. I don't ever think regulation by the government's the answer. I think deregulation would go a lot farther if they made it so, if they came into a city and said, you have to give permits in X amount of days versus years, where it is in some cities. It would give people that stability and comfort, but nobody wants to go invest tons of money into something and have a fixed income and have your expenses be variable. It won't work over time. It's going to really constrict supply, and the demand's not going to come online. So you can look at pretty much from when rent control, like look at the housing economy in New York. I think they had an open market until like 1940, and after World War II, put rent controls in, and it was just right away. Supply slowed down, development slowed down. And on the development side, if somebody comes in and builds a $50 million building, think of the property tax that brings the city, right? And when that development stops and it's just the same amount of units there, the tax burden is always going to go up, and that's just going to be put onto those same properties, and then the taxes are going to have to go up. Whereas if you can get it, so we're, development's happening all the time, new businesses are moving there, new buildings are coming in, that's a lot bigger tax base as well. So for me, if you want affordability, the answer isn't rent control. It's really the exact opposite of that. It's deregulating it, have an environment where people want to come in, take that risk, and develop new properties. Anytime government constricts or you have rent control, it just never works. It doesn't work. It's like, it's kind of like a joke, but socialism, right? People still push socialism, and you can ask them, well, give us an example of where it's worked, right? And you can go throughout all of history, and you can see all the times it didn't work. And then they'll always say, well, it hasn't been done correctly yet, right? Like, we could do it right. And that's kind of the same with this. It's like, it's, as a politician, when a huge amount of your voters probably rent, it sounds good on its face value, right? And I think in today's world where the news cycle and everything is so quick to go out and say, hey, there's going to be a little bit of temporary gain, but in 10 years, this is going to be really bad. Or the exact opposite, like, sure, maybe rents go up and it's painful for a little bit, but then we're going to get all this new supply and they'll come back down. The one is going to affect your 4-year cycle as mayor or council or whatever you're looking on in a negative way, and one's going to be positive in a voter's view. So I think it's getting the message out to people, look, we want development. Here's what we're going to do to get it, and this should, in turn, maybe bring property taxes down and therefore rents. And again, it's not landlords that dictate the rent, it's the market, right? You can only charge as much as the market, the demand is there. So if it gets too high, and I do think that's what's happened in Toronto, Vancouver, they don't have a lot of new supply. Rents continue to go up and up and up, but I think you've kind of hit a point where it's like people just can't do it. They can't pay anymore. So now something has to change, right? They got to figure out a way to make it affordable for people. And yeah, on the flip side, you take cities without rent control. Edmonton, Calgary, I think, have done a very good job of keeping up with demand. I think you'll see a lot of new units, continue to come online because people want to take that risk because there's some profit there to be had. So today on the show, we talked about rent control, why it generally never works, why I've never seen it work. I don't think there's a lot of examples in history you can point to of it working. I'm sure there's lots of arguments on the other side. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you have comments one way or the other, let me know below. Thanks for listening to today's episode. We'll see you next week.